Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful once again, that we can come here to study together. We're thankful for all the things you show us. And we know, Lord, that there's more light than we can handle, but we ask that we can bear the light and that we can understand it and that we can share it with others. Lord, we ask for special help here as we continue our study on Daniel chapter 11. We know that there's many things still to be found, but also things that have been found, we need to understand them fully. So we ask for your Holy Spirit to teach us, to help our minds to be clear, and to correct any error that we may have. We pray for the website, the July 18, 2020 website, and all the work being done in Nashville in warning people there. We just ask, Lord, that you can guide and lead, and that your work can be accomplished. We pray for each person here that's studied and the influences that we have. We ask that it can be for good. And we thank you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. So we went over Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 last time to sort of get a better handle on these lines. And we know that Daniel 11 is repeating all of this history. And just to sort of review this, sort of as a line, we got 1989, November 9th, and we got December 25th, 1991. And which we mark as the time of the end. And we parallel this with the beginning of Daniel chapter 11, where you got this period of darkness. And you have, we'll call it the fall, 539 BC. I'll put October 3rd. 13th, I mean. And then we have here, which we would just say is the fall of 537. And so this is marking the time of the end here. And we put in this history, we're going to put Reagan and Bush the first. And in this history, we put Darius, Mede, and Cyrus. So we parallel these kings. And in order to understand this, of course, we need to understand that in this history, initially, we believe that the Soviet Union came to an end here, and that was the king of the South came to an end. But as we start to look at this history as it moves on, we can realize that there's more details that were being missed. Now, so we're just going to put the kings of the United States here. So that's going to be followed by Clinton, Bush II, Obama, and Trump. And in this line, we've got Cyrus, Cambyses, Deces, however you say it, False Smyrtus, and then Darius the Great, Persian, and then finally Xerxes. And so these are these parallels that happen. And this was discovered obviously before Trump was elected. And this understanding led to the understanding of Daniel 11, verse 11, that we had made a mistake. So the idea that the Battle of Raphi and the Battle of Panium show that there was more details that occur in this history as far as the king of the north and the king of the south is concerned. But dealing with this history here as well, this is obviously Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, starting at 40b, so the time of the end happening here. And all this area, of course, development of the Sunday law. Now, some people, had a hard time with this initially, and some people still do. I've run into people who reject this idea of Trump being Xerxes for various reasons. But for the most part, we accept this, and so this line here makes a lot of sense. Now, this is going to be repeated in the line of the Roman emperors, at least the last three. So we're going to look at that a little bit today. That's better. We also have another way to look at it is we have these sections. We're going to go to some of our notes here. I need to bring these up. And this was notes that were done back in 2017. Not sure specifically who it could have been blessings. Who did them, I'm not sure. But Tavo sent them to me back then. And I'll make this larger. So we see here that we have these different sections, Daniel 11, verse 1 to 4, which we just addressed very briefly. And Daniel 11, verse 5 to 10 is the rise of the Seleucid kingdom. And you can see where he's paralleling this with the Patriot Act at 9/11 to the midnight cry when America defeats Russia. So this is the understanding that existed back in 2017. And then the last part, Daniel 11, verse 5 to 16, which I probably would have put 5 to 15. But this is Greece, and then you're going to get into the transition to pagan Rome. So maybe you could put verse 16 there, I guess, if that's how you're dividing it. And then we have the last four presidents of the USA and the four emperors of pagan Rome. So this is an area that I'm not an expert on. I'm actually not an expert on Daniel chapter 11. My understanding of it is still incomplete. That is, I don't have everything pieced together in my mind. I couldn't just draw this all out and remember everything because I haven't spent enough time on it. And I've tried to, but lately we've been pretty busy with a lot of other things that we're studying. But this section here, I have a bit of an idea about it, so hopefully we can sort through. Now, the part of this study, particularly here, which we're not going to start with, we're going to try to get through 16 to 22. But this study that was written here, that was sent to me, had to do with the Jewish League, the destruction of Jerusalem, and Constantine. And the SDA union with U.S. government, Russia defeated, Constitution overthrown, and the Sunday law. Now, we know that these ideas of Daniel 11 were rejected back in 2017, though it wasn't made public, but we know that Parminder was not in acceptance of Daniel 11 in the way that it was interpreted, but he never made that clear to anybody. But we can see why, because his whole idea is that he was against the Sunday law. Now, they still retain some of these ideas, so they could still probably argue that some of this stuff they accepted, they didn't completely reject, but of course it's not coherent and consistent any longer. So that's a problem there. And then Daniel 11, verse 30 to 40 is the rise of the papacy, the persecution through the 1260 years and the deadly wound. And so we can see that that's going to refer in our history, things that have already occurred to some degree: the removal of the Constitution, the establishment of religious tyranny, reemergence of persecution, fall of the papacy. So that sort of repeats that history that we're in, that's starting, that isn't finished. And then Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 is going to address all that history again. So each of these lines or groups addresses the same history, or the same, it all is addressing the end of the world in Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. But it's doing it in different ways. And I think you could almost, because this is a study, of course, on the book of Daniel and its connection to Leviticus 26. That's really where we started in this study. And we can see that there are some parallels to the 4 visions of Daniel and the 4 7 times, and also to the different kingdoms that arise. So, and there's a little point that I think we addressed, dealing with the book of Zechariah, dealing with the horsemen and the chariots, and that I took an interpretation. Let's see if I can find it here in one of my diagrams. So these are old ideas which I never really presented publicly. So, oops. I think keyword I have to search. I got so many files here. Just use that search. Okay, so here it is. I found this study. Make this a little bigger. So this was taking a progressive destruction of 4 and then using a reform line that begins, and then a failed reform line. So this was a series of studies that I did, but never presented, at least in any sort of complete way. And on the bottom one, you'll see I have just different ways in which I'm dividing this same line. So this is dealing with Zechariah and dealing with, there's first the chariots and then the horses. So you have the black horses, the white horses, the grizzled horses, and the beige horses. And this is a progressive destruction of 4 that happens. And we can see, if we want to look at it in another way, we could have looked at the top one, and we could have, instead of putting Nehemiah there, we could have placed Persia, right? So the kings of Persia, and then the Greeks. So this would be Alexander the Great and his empire. And then I put here the Maccabees as these grizzled horses. So you can see I don't have these dates the same. And then Pompeii would be Rome. Now, what I'm looking at here is that Rome is connected with the Maccabees and Pompeii, that Rome shows up twice in this line. I'm not sure if this is making sense to people, what I'm doing, because I know I referred to this earlier, to this vision in Zechariah, but the grizzled and the bay horses would refer to the period of the time under which you have this alliance with the papacy by the Jews, and then The bay horses would be when Pompey comes in and conquers Jerusalem. So when Rome actually comes onto the picture. And William Miller had used the date 158 BC, which is on the 1843 chart. And he had counted 666 years from 168 BC to 508. And I've shown that you can actually count another period of 666 years from 129 BC to 538. And obviously I've shown the 666 years from, not in this study, but in the other studies, from the captivity of Jehoiachin to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so I have actually 3 periods of 666 years that I believe are all valid, which I'm not doing a study on right now. But my point here is that you have this progressive destruction of 4. And in the context of the book of Daniel, when we look at the chariots in Zechariah, those would parallel the kingdoms, Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But Zechariah, Rome is already out of the scene. And so Zechariah addresses through the horses, Persia, Greece, the Jews when they're connected with Rome in 2 different ways. One, when they make a league, and the next time when they're conquered. So these are dealing with the progressive destruction of 4 generations. And so then when we get to the birth of Christ, we end up with this reform line. Now, part of the problem, when I showed this to Parminder back in, it would have been 2015, he didn't seem very interested in it at all. You know, he asked me a few questions about it, but he just sort of seemed to dismiss it. This understanding that you have progressive destruction of 4, and then you have a reform line. Now, one of the things we see is that this progressive destruction of 4, in a sense, repeats during the reform line, which was part of the problem that I had, is that we were overlapping at that time. We were dealing with the 7 kings, the last 7 kings of Judah, and the first 7 kings of Judah, and the last 7, the first 7 kings of Persia, the last 7 kings of Israel. So we were looking at these parallels, which part of them were destructions of 4, overlapping reform lines. Now, hopefully, you know, if somebody doesn't really understand what I'm talking about, feel free to ask a question. You can put it in chat if you want to. But the idea here is that when we start looking at our reform line has a reform line in it. But when we're looking at the kings, the 4 kings, we're also looking at a destruction of 4, progressive destruction of 4 that happens in our reform line, which, because we're dealing with the last 7 kings of the United States, just like we were dealing with the first 7 kings of Persia. These things are paralleling each other. And we can parallel Persia and the United States for what reason? If you think about it. Persia is a 2-horn power, Media, Persia, right? And,
they're both typified by like sheep as well.
Yes, they're both typified by sheep. So the United States is a 2-horn beast that has horns like a lamb, and we know that Persia still has 2 horns like a lamb, right?
And they both follow Babylon in a sense, like spiritual Babylon, United States follows that 1260, and then Persia follows the Babylon of 70 years.
Yes. Right. So we have the 1260 and the 70 paralleling each other. There's actually lots of different connections that we could look at that show that Persia is typifying the United States. Now it's interesting too that the evangelical world sees the parallel between Trump and Cyrus. You know, he's their deliverer, we see a parallel between Trump and Xerxes. So they're picking, the one who they think fits their model of who Trump is from their prophetic model point of view. Of course, they don't have anything comprehensive like what we have. In the evangelical world, there's a lot of picking and choosing. That's one of the things. I have spent a bit of time dealing with this idea, because I have a friend who's a Messianic Jew who believes Trump is the deliverer. He believes he is Cyrus. And, in trying to understand their thinking, there's just so many inconsistencies. And that's the thing about dispensationalist prophecy, which is futurism, is they can just pick and choose anything they want because they don't have any historical context or line in which they develop these ideas. That is, we have something that goes back looking at the past, and we look at all these lines and we can then identify who is who. The evangelical world cannot do that. They have no such consistent method. And also a big problem, probably the major problem, is that they choose modern Israel as literal Israel in Jerusalem, and that the rise of modern Israel in the 1940s is part of fulfilled prophecy. Now, we do take some things that they say and we apply them. That they will look at the symbols of Trump dealing with the 777s and the way that it's connected with the fulfillment of history in literal Israel. So I can't remember the guy's name, but their president. And anyway,
Benjamin Netanyahu.
Netanyahu. Yeah. So Benjamin Netanyahu, they take some of his dates, Trump's dates, they parallel these things, and we can see that there's some truth to that. That is, those symbols are there, but they don't have the proper way of interpreting what they mean. To them, it makes Trump look like Cyrus, like their deliverer from Babylonian captivity. And if you want to put it in that sense, in that context, and they take so many things literally from Revelation that are symbols, and yet they mix the literal and the symbolic. So they'll have things that are literal, but they're also but they'll have some things as symbolic and not literal. So they sort of pick and choose. I know that's kind of an aside here, but the point that I want to make is that in our understanding here of these lines, when we have these progressive destructions of 4 and a period of darkness and then a reform line, these progressive destructions of 4 can still occur again as a repeat of what led up to the period of darkness. And the only way that I can think sort of to understand it is that the 4th generation ends up what's DJT? Donald J. Trump. He's trying to lead people into captivity. I was just reading a chat message there. So that 4th generation is in a period of darkness, but the fourth generation is in a sense going to repeat the first 3 generations. And that's the only way that I can understand. And they repeat it in the rejection of the reform line. Now, we've also recognized there's a reform line, what we call the reform line of the United States, or a line of the United States. So we can put a time at the end on that, and we can look at the United States and how it progresses into apostasy. So it would be an anti-reform line in a sense. But that to me would be part of that progressive destruction of 4 that's happening. So that was really a problem when I first was looking at this. I didn't have a way to understand it. But I think now, in understanding Daniel chapter 11 and these repeats, we can see that there's a lot of logic in what we're doing. That is, in taking Daniel 11 and placing parts of these histories, the parts that Daniel 11 is fulfilling, and taking those histories and laying them over top of our history in different ways. But again, we have to be consistent. First is we need to understand the application of what happened historically. You can't have a false understanding of that application or of what happened in order to make an application. So the fulfillment of those prophecies, as they are in Daniel chapter 11, need to be understood correctly. And then when you're starting to make an application, you have to have a good solid reason why you're doing that. And you can see that we have a very good solid reason for taking the first 4 verses of Daniel 11 and placing them over top of this reform line that we have, which would be Daniel 11 verse 40b to 46, or maybe at least, or 46 to 45, maybe at least till verse 44. So, we're not necessarily saying that Trump's going to be there at the very end. As a person, he may not be, but definitely we're leading up to that Sunday law. Trump will be involved in the Sunday law, and then finally the papacy will come to its end. Whether Trump's there or not, that would be something we'd have to study and probably wait until it happens, maybe, fully to understand all that history. So when we look at the history of what was happening, so let's go back here to some of the notes, just looking at them. So this rise of the Seleucid king with the treaty of the king of the north and the south between the 2 kings won by the king of the south. So Daniel 11 verse 5 to 10. We saw that there was these battles back and forth. This was the development of the king of the north and the king of the south. Now we look at this present truth application, and we just jump in the Patriot Act at 9/11 to the midnight cry. Here, I didn't share the screen properly. Didn't share it at all. So that didn't work. There we go. So the author here puts, the Patriot Act at 9/11, and I don't know if I would have made that jump even there, in that the rise of the Seleucid kingdom, the treaty with the king of the north and the king of the south, war between the 2 kings. We know in studying this history, we go back to 1979. So there's a whole development of what's happening in this history between Russia and the United States. And we know that the Patriot Act, well, one thing we do know is that the Russia is connected in the history that I remember in 1979, from a personal point of view, is that there was supposed to be the Olympics in Russia. This is what I remember, is there was supposed to be these Olympics in Russia in 1979 or 1980. But in 1979, this war in Afghanistan began. And I had no idea what Afghanistan was. I figured it was where Afghans came from, those little blankets that you make. That's all I knew about Afghanistan. And I didn't understand at that time, because I was fairly young, 16. I thought, why is the Olympics going to be canceled? I was into sports back then. So I was a little bit disappointed. But this was this battle between the United States and Russia. And Afghanistan, of course, was an Islamic country. So we know that there was this battle, and we would call it a proxy war that was happening between the United States and Russia in Afghanistan. And it's kind of strange in a way, because we know that this led up to eventually what happened was the fall of the Soviet Union itself. So that's that 10-year period that we would have talked about from 1979 to 1989. But if you just start at the Patriot Act is 1996 or something that it's first written, I believe. It's put implemented in 9/11 in 2001. So I'm not sure if I would make that parallel. So we're going to go through this history a little bit more, because now, and one of the things you'll see here, of course, is we're going to have here in this next part. So they go verse 5 to 10, and then they go 5 to 16. So I don't know why they wrote it this way. It may be just how they dealt with it in the paper. But they parallel Daniel 11, verse 5 to 16. They're going back to 538 AD to the Sunday law, with emphasis on midnight cry in the Sunday law. And that's the Greece and the transition to pagan Rome is the historic fulfillment. So, of course, they're dealing with the rise of the papacy here. So to me, this just seems a little bit mixed up in the approach of it, that you're taking this first part and you're taking this history from verse 5 to verse 10 to cover something. And then you take verse 5 to verse 16 to cover something else. So, and all I know is that because this paper doesn't address this point, this paper is dealing with verse 23 to 29. And I couldn't find any of the old papers that had gone over the earlier studies of Daniel 11. And maybe somebody has those, but I couldn't find them. Probably the main reason is I got a new email back in 2017, and my old email that I'd had for about 10 years or so, that I got most of my email from, that was closed when about a year after I quit my job at the university. So I lost all those emails, all that documentation. So I may have gotten it on that email, but this one I got in my other email. So not my university email. So anyway, so we want to cover this period, and then see if we can get up to the Jewish League. Now, to do that, we're gonna go through the paper by Swearingen, however you say his name, Tidings Out of the Northeast, and we're gonna go back because we covered some of this already. But when we did it, I didn't do a very good job of it. That's the way I would look at it. Now he's going to cover, and I'll blow this up so it's bigger. So he's going to cover Daniel 5 to 15, and we read some of this here. So we know this is these battles between what they're called the 5 Syrian wars, between the two powers over the region of Syria, Judea, Palestine, where the Jewish people resided, right? And we went through some of these. So we're just going to kind of go through this cursorily again. And we know this is going to culminate in the Battle of Raphia and then the Battle of Panium. So highlights, we know that the kingdom was divided. They joined themselves together to fight against each other. But then we finally ended up with just the king of the north and the king of the south, which was Ptolemy and Seleucid, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid kingdoms or empires. And yeah, so I'm just skipping ahead a bit too much. So here I want to get to this verse, which is our pivotal verse, Daniel 11, verse 11, 10 and 11, I believe. Let me see here. So we're going to go to these 11 and 12. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, which is anger, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north, and shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. So I remember in 2017, and of course it was on January 14, 2017, that Jeff presented this in Alberta. It was the first time that he had presented Raphia and Panium, and that's where he marked, of course, the idea of the pandemic, though we didn't have time setting at that time. We weren't setting dates for anything. But what I remember back then was the idea that this persecution was going to happen. So what I remember was this is the battle of Raphia, and that Russia was going to win this battle against the United States. Now, later on, we came to believe that this was going to happen on November 9th, based on Tess's studies. So the United States and Russia were going to have this war. So this battle between the King of the North and the King of the South was not the battle that happened in 1798 or the battle that happened in 1989. It was this battle that was still future. And this battle we would call then midnight, and then we would have the Battle of Paneum would be the midnight cry. So this is the way that we understood it at that time. And that when the king of the South won, it was going to persecute their own people. So they cast down many 10,000s. That's the way I understood it. And so the idea is that the Soviet Union was going to do this. They would win this battle. They would be, their heart would be lifted up because of this victory over the United States. And they would also begin persecuting Christians, Seventh-day Adventists in the United States. So I could ask how many, raise your hands, how many remember that interpretation or that understanding of this, but obviously that's not going to work here. But you could maybe just put in the chat, if you want to, just put, if you've not heard of it, if you've not heard of that interpretation. So, you know, I'll look at those notes later. Somebody's asking how we chose the last Roman emperors. Wiki shows another order. I'm not sure how we chose it. I'm not actually up on the last Roman emperors. Russia would persecute SDAs, yes. So that was the idea. Stephen put that in his chat. Russia was going to persecute Seventh-day Adventists after the Battle of Raphia. Now, the reason why I remember that too was there was some fake news connected with this. So somebody there who hadn't heard of it yet. But there was fake news that happened in 2017. In the spring, Russia had basically made a law against Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, it wasn't just against Jehovah's Witnesses, it was against all religious groups, that they were not allowed to evangelize. And all this thing would lead to the confiscation of churches, the disbandment of those religious bodies that wouldn't follow the rules on how a church, a non-Catholic church in Russia was to function. So, you know, they were limited to only having their church services in their church. No public evangelism would be allowed. No way of reaching out to other people. No, you weren't allowed to have converts. So it'd basically be the end of groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses. And the Jehovah's Witnesses did not comply, and they lost a lot of their churches. So now there was this rumor that this was happening to Seventh-day Adventists. And it was interesting that the conference president, Ted Wilson, put out a statement, which ended up in the review, that the church was not having problems in Russia because we complied to the Russian rules regarding religion. Of course, when you think about it, part of the thing that I understood at that time was that Seventh-day Adventists basically had compromised. And we could see this, that they were just willing to do whatever a government said in order to maintain their churches. They weren't willing to stand up against governments, and that this was a sign that the Seventh-day Adventist Church would willingly go along with a Sunday law. That they would find some excuse, some reason why this would happen. And so it was just an illustration of that. Now, also in the context of the prediction before midnight, the fact that there was this fake news that was being used in the movement to establish our understanding of this passage here. Parallel to me, what was happening at May 2nd in 1844 with Samuel Snow's use of fake news to establish 31 AD for the crucifixion of Christ. That is, he used fake news, but the principle still, that came from that, or the truth that came from that, was still valid. And so I think that's how I looked at what happened in 2017. So there's a lot of interesting things that happened in 2017. Yeah, and just a few notes that I'm going to read, because people obviously who are watching this video later online, I'm not sure how much you can read the notes. I don't know if you can, whether they show up or not. I've never even looked at that. But so we had Stephen saying Russia would persecute SDAs. Rudolph saying he's not heard of that yet. Angela saying Russia had been often brutally persecuting SDAs and others not worshiping the state since the Soviet Union was established. As far as I know, the Tsars weren't too happy with non-Eastern Orthodox since foreign Tsarininas had to convert to Eastern Orthodox. And only the Orthodox Church had a free pass because it was interlocked with Russian history, John Mark says. So yeah, some of you, of course, have heard of these ideas. And also we know that this is how we interpreted this passage. Whether we still interpret it that way or not, I'm not 100% certain. So in reading this here, he says, having secured enough time to assemble a train a large invasion force, having described in this passage as a great multitude, Ptolemy IV would thus be moved with choler to continue the Fourth Syrian War against the king of the north. He would march his army into Palestine once again, taking up a position south of Gaza near Rafah. And this is in 2017 BC. As we know, that we mark this as midnight, and the symbol of midnight is July 21st, and 2117 is a symbol of July 21st. And then on June 22nd, so June 22nd, the connection between June 22nd and our line is very interesting. I'm developing a paper where I'm dealing with that a bit more. But June 22nd is Samuel Snow's Pentecost letter. And if you count from June 22nd, 1844, and you count 391 and a half days, you come to July 21st, 1845. So from 1844 to 1845, if you count. And this is how we found not July 21st, July 18th. And this is how we found that when we went from July 18th backwards, we could get Samuel Snow's letters. So it shows that the part of this message of the midnight cry and June 22nd, which is the prediction before the midnight part of that, is about July 18th. So it ties July 21st, which is a symbol of midnight, June 22nd, the symbol of Pentecost, the symbol of this movement, and July 18th together in Samuel Snow's letters. But we can see how they're also tied here in this message in dealing with the Battle of Rafah. So just kind of an interesting aside. Maybe it's not even really an aside. It's kind of an important point. On June 22nd, the two armies met in battle, and Antiochus III would initially taste success, but after the cavalry on both sides had neutralized each other, the infantry would be left to decide the outcome. As it turned out, the superior wisdom of his Greek commanders and the well-disciplined condition of his army would allow Ptolemy IV to triumph. In the end, the multitude of the Seleucid army was given into his hand. His victory at Rafah would present a similar opportunity to that of Antiochus III 2 years earlier, as Syria would then lay open to invasion. Yet, consistent with the cautious attitude characteristic of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy IV would be content with only regaining whole Syria and did not complete the conquest of Syria in its entirety. Thus, while having taken away the multitude, Ptolemy IV would not be strengthened by his victory. So it was the other point, is that they're weakened by it. This victory would return to his homeland fully, this victory, and not strengthened by this victory, and would return to his homeland fully content with the status quo. And so the parallel to that would be that the Soviet Union, or Russia in this case now, would win this battle, which eventually we had developed into an information war, but in 2017 it wasn't being talked about in that way. And there was a whole bunch of misinterpretations and things that got mixed in with this, of what this battle was about. And I'm not sure if people are really clear about it. I think Jeff understands what, his point regarding what's going to happen. But it diminishes November 9th as far as being this battle between the King of the North and the King of the South, in the type of battle that we're looking at, and we're moving that really to July 18th. So we look at this attack on the United States by Islam as really an attack on the United States by Russia. So that's the idea behind it. So in a sense, we've moved midnight from November 9th to July 18th. Though I still think I would rather see this as a period of time that we're in, since November 9th, 2019, to July 18th, which is basically a few weeks away, 5 weeks and a couple days. We're seeing this, to me, is the period that would be talked about as the Battle of Raphia. And so we obviously have to understand it differently than we did in 2017. Now, the next part is the Battle of Panium. For the King of the North shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. So once again, the King of the North would return with a multitude greater than the former, coming after certain years with a great army and with much riches. In other words, Antiochus III would regroup militarily from the years 2012 to 2004 BC and attempt to renew his warfare with Egypt. He would also seek to capitalize on the death of Ptolemy IV, who would be succeeded by a 5-year-old boy named Ptolemy V Epiphanes. And so Antiochus III obviously didn't see Ptolemy V as a worthy opponent in some ways. He was an easy target. And so this is the Battle of Raphia after the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC. So they started the Fifth Syrian War, and it's in the Fifth Syrian War that we have the Battle of Panium, right? So that's well-known battle that, and we know that we've connected Panium, which is actually Banium, and it's also Mount Hermon, and it's also referred to as Sion in the Old Testament. So there's a lot of symbolism dealing with this Battle of Panium, obviously. One is the idea that it's the gates of hell are there, and this is where Jesus and Peter, when Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," and he says, "Upon this rock I'll build my church, and you are Peter, so you're Petros, but upon this Petra I'll build my church." And so the Catholic Church uses this as an argument that Peter is the foundation upon which the church is built. He's the first pope, so to speak, which of course is really an invented history. Peter never served that role in any way, and in Rome or any other place. It's also called Caesarea Philippi. So we have Caesarea Philippi, Panium, Banium, Mount Hermon, and Sion. So we have all these different names for this place. And also the gates of hell. So there's this place they call the gates of hell. And so Jesus says, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And we were the first people who noticed this connection between the gates of hell and Caesarea Philippi. So there's obviously all this history that I'm not going to deal with right now, and all this symbolism that we could look at. But one of the things we see about the Battle of Panium is that it's addressing this whole issue. The United States itself is going to in this battle, defeat Russia, if we want to put it that way. And this defeat of Russia will lead to the Sunday Law. So that's the basic idea of this history. And so we mark that as the Midnight Cry, paralleling the Midnight Cry. So I'm just going to illustrate this so that people can see it, for those that really like to visualize things, like to see things visually. So when we looked at, and I'm going to put these names underneath here. So again, we got Clinton, Bush II, Obama, and Trump. Did I do that right? Yeah, there we go. And so in this history here, we know that we're heading towards a Sunday Law. So I'll just put a Sunday Law here. And in trying to understand this as a reform line, we know that before the Sunday Law, and this isn't really in here. I'll put the Sunday Law at the end. And then we're going to have, in this history, midnight and the Midnight Cry. Let's put it that way. So we have this history that goes before the Sunday Law. And in Millerite history, this would have been July 21st, and this would have been August 15th. And we took these histories and we would put 9/11. So here I can put 9/11 back here. It's in the time of Bush II. So you got 9/11. And this history in here is the development of our message under the first angel's message, which is empowered here, and the arrival of the second angel's message. So that's our other studies on the lines. But midnight and the Midnight Cry are here, and we would just put them, the way that we understood it is, this is Raphia, and this is Paneum. And these lead to the Sunday Law. And now, the thing about this, though, is this is not the line of the 144,000. This is the line of the priests. So, or pardon me, of the Levites. So the priests here, they're going to have a message here to give to the Levites. But this is supposed to be the midnight and the Midnight Cry for the Levites. So the Levites here will end up coming in at Raphia, and then they will give the Midnight Cry. And then together they're going to go through this Sunday Law. That's sort of the idea that was understood here, and still to some degree understood, though, you know, we've developed it differently. We have a lot more detail. So this is just kind of a sketch of how we saw things in 2017. So a sketch of how we understand it now, because we understand more detail. Now, so this role of Raphia and Paneum is that it leads to the Sunday Law. And then you can clearly see that if we're going to take this, I'm going to put 1979 up here, or 1798, pardon me, 1798 up here. So in 1798, if you're going to put this whole big line on here, because you're going to put this in Millerite history. So let's just put this line up here. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah. You know, 9/11 here is going to be April 19th, 1844. And we're also going to have August 11th, 1840. And August 11th and 1840 both come here. And then we have midnight and the Midnight Cry in this history. And then we're going to have October 22. So midnight cry. Now we then paralleled this line and we said, this is the Sunday Law. This is Midnight Cry. So this is August 15th. We're paralleling these. So the way that I would look at it then, if we're going to say that this is the line of the Levites, and this is going to, I'm going to go through this on Sunday in a bit more detail. But if that's the line of the Levites, and here you have the line of the Millerites, you don't see room here for the line of the priests. So this line of the priests is something else in our history that's not the Millerites, and it's not the Protestants. And this is a problem. So we're going to address it on Sundays. We're going to try to understand that. My main point here in illustrating this is that this is how we understood Raphia and Panium, that they were paralleling this history. Now the group here that ends up receiving the midnight and the midnight cry, as I said, is the Millerites. But the group that gives that is actually a person in this history, which is Samuel Snow, who's going to give midnight and the midnight cry. In this history, we're going to have the priests who are going to give the midnight and the midnight cry. Now, of course, the Millerites join at the midnight cry with Samuel Snow. And we know here that in this history, this midnight cry, the Seventh-day Adventists are going to join with this movement, with the priests, in giving the midnight cry. The thing that I want to point out, though, still, that when we look at this, this is not the line of the 144,000. This is a smaller line within a bigger line in our history, because we know that this symbolizes the close of probation. The Sunday law is the close of probation for Seventh-day Adventists, for priests and Levites. But it's not the close of probation. The close of probation is something that's still in the future. And even in this history, October 22nd starts a period of judgment, the Day of Atonement, that's going to end at the close of probation. That's past this point. And so there's this problem that I see that we have with these lines, and especially as we start to go through this history in Daniel chapter 11, is if we're going to place Raphia and Panium here in our history in the line of the Levites, I have always understood that these are singular events. That is, you don't have Raphia continually repeating, and you don't have Panium continually repeating, and that midnight and midnight cry are waymarks in this line only that are typified by Raphia and Panium. That is, you can't have the United States have another war against the Soviet Union and bring them to an end other than at Panium. Now, of course, it could be that we're wrong. So I'm saying it could be that we're wrong about placing this. I'm not saying we are, but by replacing these symbols of Raphia and Panium here in our line of the Levites where we have placed it, that maybe if this was wrong and that Raphia and Panium were actually referring to something that's still going to happen future, then, we would have to see this as typical. So if we were wrong about this, not wrong in placing these here symbolically, but wrong about what the actual events were, that those actual events are going to be future, then this line would just be typical of what's going to happen future, and it doesn't actually happen here. Now, I'm not saying that that's right, but I'm saying it is a possibility. And that's one of the things we would have to see as time goes on, because we could still argue that November 9th was Raphia and July 18th is going to be Panium, but not the actual events of Raphia and Panium, as what's typified in Daniel chapter 11, that this would be something that was internal within our movement. And that's a possibility. I'm not saying, again, I'm not arguing that that's the correct view. I'm just saying that that's something I see as a possibility in looking at these lines. So my point here in dealing with this section is we need to understand Raphia and Panium. We need to understand it historically. And we need to understand how we came to place it in our history. And then we've sort of began moving it as time progresses. So we're not really placing November 9th as midnight, as Raphia, as we were in the past, because we don't see the event that we initially were talking about, and that is the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. It didn't happen on November 9th. And so in trying to understand then how we're going to apply that, to understand how to apply that, as we move forward, that's going to be part of the thing that I think will unfold as time goes on. Now, we say that we have Daniel 11 understood, and I think we do in a certain sense. Obviously, there's more detail that we haven't come to understand. And I think, Jeff, if you look at his studies on Daniel chapter 11, and if you haven't watched all the videos, I suggest you watch them again. If I was going to put his point was that we've put together the different sections of Daniel 11, and we know where they overlap. And so we've sorted out some of that part of it. But I don't know if we've sorted out all the details. At least I haven't seen it that I know that I've been watching his presentations that I can say every single verse, I know what it means. And maybe that's just a lack of understanding on my part. Maybe I missed some of those things in watching the videos. But that's why this study is important here. So as we're looking at Daniel chapter 11, we do need to get the historical application correct, but we know that we have to place it correctly in our time. And I think that's where I have the problems in understanding this. So I'll go back to sharing the screen here. Now this is where we're going to have the United States, the papacy come in. And it says, and in those times there shall be many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision. So we know historically that Rome came in and it actually basically sealed the fate of Egypt. So, well, we'll just see what it says here. So the king of the north shall come, shall cast up a mount, shall take the most fenced cities, and arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. So he interprets this, the battle of Panium resulted in the expulsion of Egypt from Syria once and for all, while at the same time seriously weakening its status as a Mediterranean power. Now we sort of apply that then in our history because there's this battle in Syria, and Russia and Syria are allies, and so we're using literal Syria in our understanding of this prophecy in the present time. But Syria, of course, is really Islam. But Syria is just the symbol that's being used, but it happens to be the literal power that exists at this time. While at the same time seriously weakening its status as a Mediterranean power, having become vulnerable to foreign invasion. This defeat had marked the beginning of the end for the Ptolemaic Egypt. Many in those times would stand up against the king of the south, and this would be especially true of the career of Antiochus Epiphanes. He had launched a successful invasion of Egypt that would later bring pagan Rome directly into Middle Eastern affairs and eventually lead to the demise of both the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties. After the death of Ptolemy V Epiphanes, another young boy, King Ptolemy VI Philometor, would ascend to the throne at a very young age. This young king would be under the guardianship of two ministers of state, Eulaeus and Linnaeus, who began to plan another invasion of Syria in 170 BC, in revenge for the Egyptian defeat at the Battle of Panium. Despite a recent warning from Rome, Antiochus IV proposed to defeat the plans of these two men by launching a first strike invasion of Egypt. As it turned out, Rome was still involved in the affairs of Greece in dealing with the king Perseus of Macedonia and could not involve itself in this particular conflict. Furthermore, Antiochus IV moved with such speed that he actually met the Egyptian army before they even crossed the desert into southern Syria. Because the arms of the south would not have any strength to withstand him, Antiochus IV crushed the Egyptian army so convincingly that he marched unopposed into Egypt and occupied the city of Memphis, while at Alexandria, Eulaeus and Linnaeus had been overthrown and replaced by two new ministers of state, Comnenus and Cineas, who had proclaimed the younger brother of Ptolemy VI as king. Ptolemy VII Euergetes II was his name. satisfied that Egypt was divided in an internal conflict between two rival brother kings, Antiochus IV withdrew and returned home to Syria in 697. Yet interestingly, Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VII formed an alliance and agreed to share the throne of Egypt. This alarming development moved Antiochus IV to rethink his position and reinvade the king of the south in the next year, 168 BC. Now this is the Battle of Pydna. And what we've done is we've noticed the Battle of Pydna also occurs on June 22nd. So one of the things that could be a possibility is that we could look at this Battle of Pydna as, well, the way that we look at it is we look at it somewhat as parallel to the Battle of Raphia, but also they're 49 years apart, which is a symbol. And Elder Jeff did a presentation on this, and I can't remember all the details about it, but he connected the two, and he put them in our line dealing with what happened with Trump. So it's very interesting. So that had to do with Trump being impeached, and then finally on February 5th, 2020, that Trump was exonerated. I can't remember, but anyway, the impeachment process was stopped by a vote against impeachment. So anyway, the point is that we connect these things in our history, and we use this period of time to line up in our history. So I think it's kind of interesting that we do that. And so this is using Raphia and Panium and Pydna or Raphia and Pydna here in this context as waymarks in the line of Trump. So it's kind of interesting how we do some of this, and I'm not sure how to fit it all together, but it definitely seemed very compelling presentation. So I recommend you look for that. It would have been nice if when they did these videos that they would have put the topic, as part of the title, so you could search them easier, because they're all just studies on Daniel 11. But probably just start at the beginning and watch all the way through all the presentations. There's 40 some. Okay. So it says Rome was now in a position to intervene in the behalf of Egypt. So Rome comes into the picture, and we know that Rome establishes the vision. But Rome comes here early. So that's part of where before they really should come in. So they come in this intervening part. So we have 168. Rome is now in a position to intervene in the behalf of Egypt. The Roman embassy headed by Gaius Populus Linnaeus met Antiochus IV at Alexandria in the same year. As the two men greeted, Pompilius promptly took his staff and drew a circle on the ground around the feet of the Seleucid king, ordering him to evacuate Egypt at once. He was not allowed to step outside the circle until he had acquiesced to Rome's demands. Thus, under the threat of Roman intimidation, Antiochus IV agreed to withdraw, and Rome's ambassadors escorted both him and his army safely out of Egypt. So Rome comes here, in a sense, to protect Egypt. In addition to being one of the many Seleucid kings that would stand up against the king of the south, Antiochus IV would also be one of the robbers of thy people, namely Daniel's people, Israel. Now, I'm not sure if I agree with this interpretation of it. So we took the robbers of thy people would be Rome, and I would still take that position. So this is just what this commentator says, namely Daniel's people, Israel, while occupying Egypt the second time. Antiochus IV had heard that Jerusalem had rebelled against Seleucid rule and declared for Ptolemy. Still upset from his humiliation in the hands of Rome and in desperate need of financial resources, Antiochus IV viewed this defection as treason and sought to exact revenge by plundering the city and the temple. Because Daniel's chosen people could not withstand him, Antiochus IV would successfully invade Jerusalem and rob the people of Daniel. He would strip the sanctuary of all its treasures, plunder the resources of the city, murder thousands of people, selling many more thousands into slavery. So this is not the interpretation that we have in Daniel and Revelation. So I'm going to go there and look at this passage, what he says about it. And here it is, verse 14. And so I need to blow this up so you can see this a little better. And let's do it that way. So this is Uriah Smith. So here's his look at this history. Antiochus Magus was not the only one who stood up against the infant Ptolemy. So he introduces a bunch of different names that we haven't actually had in this history. So he says, just halfway down there, at the same time, Philip of Macedon entered into a league with Antiochus to divide the dominions of Ptolemy between them, each proposing to take the parts which lay nearest and most convenient to him. There was a rising up against the king of the south sufficient to fulfill the prophecy, and it resulted beyond doubt in the exact events which the prophecy forecast. A new power is now introduced, the robbers of thy people. Literally, says Thomas Newton, the sons of the breakers of thy people. Far away on the banks of the Tiber, a kingdom had been nourishing ambitious projects and dark designs. Small and weak at first, it grew in strength and vigor, with marvelous rapidity, reaching out cautiously here and there to try its prowess and test its warlike arm, until, with consciousness of its power, it boldly reared its head among the nations of the earth and seized with invincible hand the helm of affairs. Hence the name of Rome stands upon the page of history, destined for long ages to control the world and to exert a mighty influence among the nations, even to the end of time. Rome spoke, and Syria and Macedonia soon found a change coming over the aspect of their dream. The Romans interfered in behalf of the young king of Egypt, determined that he should be protected from the ruin devised by Antiochus and Philip. And this was in 200 BC, and one of the first important influences of the Romans in the affairs of Syria and Egypt. Roland furnishes the following succinct account of this matter. So we can see here that there's a difference between Swearingen and Smith. Now, I would lie with the side of Smith on this issue. So, I'm not going to, settle it here by just saying that. I think people need to study it over and look at the history and decide for themselves. But you can see there's going to be a difference if you're going to take that, the one that is the robbers of thy people is Rome, or if it's Antiochus. So, if you're dealing with Syria. So there's just a difference there. And maybe, we're wrong about it. I don't know. But the idea that to establish the vision, to me, it has to be that Rome establishes the vision. And that would be my argument, is that Rome establishes the vision. And the Romans are more than any other people are the subject of Daniel's prophecy. The first interference in the affairs of these kingdoms is here referred to as being the establishment or the demonstration of the truth of the vision, which predicted the existence of such a power. Now, if you look up this passage, I'll just get this back so you can see the Bible. Pull this up. The word here, you probably can't see that, it's too small, but it's the word chazon, this vision. And so we know that this is this larger vision. And that would be pretty obvious that it wouldn't be the Mara vision that's being talked about here in Daniel 11. So the establishment of this vision is really this bigger picture of Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And so Rome establishes the vision. And so to think about that, obviously it can't be Greece that establishes the vision. It can't be, Persia that establishes the vision. Can't even be Babylon. Because this vision that we're dealing with in Daniel chapter 11 is ultimately about Rome. That is the power that is rising. And this is the power that's at the end of the world. And if you think about it, all of these visions, even though they're dealing with Persia and then Greece, they're leading to what happens with Rome. And even though it's going to start out here with pagan Rome, ultimately these are all pointing to what happens during papal Rome. And specifically, papal Rome at the end of the world in its resurrected form. And another way to sort of think about this, at least the way that I would think about it, is that the papacy at the end of the world is this resurrected papacy. So it receives a deadly wound in 1798. And we know that in the time of the end, it's obviously resurrected. 1798 receives a deadly wound. And in our history, that wound begins to be healed. And the first healing of it, of course, I would see as happening in the 80s with Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II. And definitely you see for the first time since 1798 that the papacy actually has a role where the Pope is sort of a superhero or a celebrity rather than just somebody that is in charge of the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul II created a celebrity status for the Pope so that even non-Catholics were interested in him. And of course, it's Pope John Paul II and Reagan who combined to overthrow the Soviet Union. Now, this is then the rise of modern Rome. Now, modern Rome is the papacy and the United States together. So the United States is the military power of the papacy. Now, as we look at the end time events, and it's hard, this is something I'd really like to discuss with people, sort of have a back and forth. But we know that the United States and the papacy have joined together to some degree. But we don't see the papacy really prominent right now in working with the United States on a visible level. Trump is interested in evangelicals, and even though we saw for a time that evangelicals were accepting Pope Francis, and there's many evangelicals and Christians who accept the Pope, he's sort of been behind the scenes. He's not really in the headlines during this time of the pandemic. Once in a while we hear from him, but he's not a major player. The focus always seems to be on Trump. Trump is always in the headlines. And because of that, nobody else can be. Nothing else can be. So even when you have the pandemic, it's all about Trump. When you have the protesting that's happening in the United States, it's always about Trump. Everything is always about Trump, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, that some person can dominate the news in the way that Trump has ever since he entered into the race for the White House and won the White House. It's pretty remarkable. But the Pope is now sort of more behind the scenes ever since Trump came along. Yet, Trump visited the Pope. I don't know how many of you ever watched the video of him visiting the Pope. It is pretty interesting. Not a lot of talking going on, but a lot of ceremony and a pretty interesting place where they meet, pretty fancy. But anyway, in trying to understand the role of the papacy, we know it's the United States that causes all the world to worship the beast in its image. It's the one that gives the mark of the beast. And, many Christians, many Adventists, I should say, when they're looking at the ones who are opposed to the papacy, they're always looking at the actions of the papacy, but they aren't as concerned about the actions of the United States. And I think that's really where our message has always been focused upon obviously the connection between the papacy and the United States, but we recognize it's the United States that is that power. So even some Christians who are opposed to the papacy actually support Trump. And some Adventists who are opposed to the papacy support Trump. They see Trump as good. And yet, when you look at the Sunday law, I don't see how you could ever have a Sunday law without somebody like Trump giving the Sunday law. And I've talked with people on Facebook who just says, Trump is never going to give the Sunday law. Now, I'm not sure why they believe that. I think in some ways they believe that he's good, that he supports the Constitution, that he would never do something like the Sunday law. But of course, we know that if there's a nuclear attack on the United States, that definitely would change things. Because the Constitution itself isn't going to protect the United States from nuclear attacks. And we've seen also that the Constitution, to some degree, has been set aside when it comes to this pandemic. That definitely it has been unconstitutional in the way that it's applied. So those are the thoughts that I have regarding those passages of Scripture. Now, the next section is Daniel 16, and dealing with this history. And I don't think we're going to have time to do it. So one is, I don't know if any of you know this, but I'm only going to go to 1 o'clock today. So I'm not going to go as far as I did. And right now it's 12:30. So I don't know how far I can get in this next section. So, but I think we should at least start to look at it. We have enough time to look at it. We're just not going to be able to come to a complete conclusion. So I'm going to go back here. And did somebody have a comment at all?
Yes, it seems to me that the Pope is working very hard, from what I've been seeing in the last year, to bring the world together under his ideas of global warming or climate change, and then he's kind of working into that the Sunday law, or Sunday sacredness, as he calls it, or several people have coined it. And I think he's just working under the covers. He's trying to get everything set up.
Yeah, and this is the kind of thing I wanted to really, discuss, because in trying to see what the Pope is doing right now, he actually is appealing to the left. He's supporting all the initiatives of the left, the social justice warriors, the Black Lives Matters, everything that's left. Pope Francis is for, and the left supports them. And you can see that in that the Omega movement supports the Pope. They see him as a good Pope, which I think is rather interesting. Now, one of the things I've learned from what happened over the last 5 or 6 months is that, or 7 or 8 months now, I guess, is that conservative people can turn on a dime to totally reject what they once believed. And that's because their beliefs are not based upon principles that are well-founded and well thought out. People's beliefs are based upon a mob mentality. What does my neighbor think? What will make me look acceptable to those around me? I don't know how many of you thought about that idea, but Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about this principle on how when we grow up as children, the children look to decide what is good and bad behavior. They look to the adults around them, their parents, and they want to see their reaction. And so our morality is just a type of conformity to what people around us want. It's not based upon principle. And so people can change their views very quickly. And we could probably see that happen in the United States, that depending on who the enemy is, or is perceived to be the enemy, people's views can change very drastically. Yeah, you had another comment about that? Chris?
Well, the rise of the social networking tools that we have on the internet. I mean, all these things seem to be, I believe Satan directed and led to bring about his end. God is all power, all omniscient. Satan, he's not. He has to use technical equipment and technical tools to try to keep an eye on what people are doing and where they're going, what they're saying, and so forth.
Yeah, the world is really changing around us, and I think it's hard for us to grasp what is happening. Even for us in this movement, because we've had a certain idea of how we think things are going to unfold. That we've had for years as Adventists, and yet we see that the Sunday law has to come, but how it's going to come. There are basically within Adventism, many people are looking at the Pope. They're looking at all the issues dealing with global warming and all the social justice warriors. They see that as the source of where the Sunday law is going to come from, and they see the protection from that as somebody like Trump, the United States Constitution. The evangelicals, in that sense, would be seen as people who would be opposed to the Sunday law. So the question is, how does the marriage from our point of view, between Trump and the Pope actually occur? What events are going to happen that will cause these seeming enemies to be working together to bring about a Sunday law? I think that's really the problem that we have to grapple with in trying to understand this, right? You see my point. Everybody, I think, should be able to see the point that I'm making there.
Sounds like a July 18 possibility.
Well, and that's why, to me, July 18th makes so much sense in that context, because we definitely have a civil war in the United States right now. And Ellen White said that we would. And it's not so much even black and white. It's about rich and poor. It's a Republican Democratic battle. So you could say it's left and right. There's lots of different ways in which you could analyze what's happened in the United States. But definitely, it's a revolution. The United States has changed. The world has changed drastically in the last few months. And I don't think, if it wasn't for the pandemic, myself personally, I don't think we would see what we see now on the streets in the United States and around the world. I think the pandemic has been like wake-up call. No, not wake-up call. Maybe it's like a catalyst. It's just caused this tension between one is people don't trust the government, they don't trust almost anything, and society is just being fractured. So even before these riots, I had read an article in I think it was in the Atlantic, which actually was a good article. Most of the time they're not, but this guy just tried to point out that basically we don't know what directions that the world's going to go into, but we know that it's not ever going to go back to what it was. That the world has actually entered into a revolution, and there's nobody that can really predict it from his point of view of what's going to happen. And of course we can see that now, people calling for the end of police being funded by the government. I'm not sure what that would mean, but that people actually seriously consider that we should get rid of the police seems pretty drastic measure. And I mean, I don't know what would happen if you did that. I'm not sure how you would even do that. If you don't have police, how do you even have court systems? How do you have the rule of law? I'm not sure. But this is part of the problem as we start to look ahead, as we're going to start to look ahead at these other chapters in Daniel chapter 11, or the other passages, the other sections, is that we're going to see that the United States, its role is very different than what we imagined, because part of the reason the United States, and we kind of knew this as Seventh-day Adventists, we'd say, well, there's going to be an economic collapse. There has to be some calamity that is going to cause the United States to implement the Sunday law. And but we couldn't really imagine, I couldn't anyway, myself personally, I couldn't imagine how you could just unite such divergent views, atheists and on all these different people together to support something like a Sunday law. And, it has to be a bipartisan Sunday law. I mean, everybody has to agree with it. You can't just have Trump imposing a Sunday law against everybody's wishes. Or you couldn't have, even the Democrats, if they were in power, imposing a Sunday law against everyone's wishes. I mean, you just couldn't do it.
But
It has to be something that everybody believes in. What's that?
I say the beast and the false prophet have been preparing for that.
Wouldn't there also be a shift of consciousness, especially after the 18th of July? I mean, everybody's going to think completely different to what they are now.
Yeah.
I mean, we've already, like you say, after the virus, we're already 2 meters apart from each other. Everybody's acting differently, looking at each funny. But the other thought I had was, if that would happen, well, obviously it's going to happen, the 18th of July, Trump would have to put America into martial law state. And if I'm correct, if that happens, and it might not happen instantly, then you can write the elections off anyway, and he gets the next 4 years.
Yeah, well, you actually can't, even under martial law, you can't, according to the Constitution, you have to have the election.
Oh, you have to?
Yeah, there's no way to actually avoid the election in the United States.
Okay, I thought it was the other way around, if there was.
Yeah,
okay.
I looked into it. There's articles in Wikipedia, they go through it, what happened in that case. You would still have to have the election. Now, I think, of course, you could have an election that's fixed. But
chaos.
I don't know if you would need to. I would think that in that situation, when you're attacked from outside, people that are enemies will join together. Usually with strategies that they're going to take down the people that they join with, right? So they make agreements, but those agreements don't end up, they don't really mean them. They just using them as a convenience to get what they want. So yeah, there's a lot of things that, when we start to look at what's coming, and that's why I think Daniel 11:16-22 is going to address that a little bit more. And just going back to, I'm just going to bring up these notes. I'm going to go back to these other notes here. So they have 16-23 here. So dealing with the pagan emperors, the 4 pagan emperors, which we're going to look at. And somebody had asked a question about how we determine who they are. I think, that's probably what we're going to have to do next week, is we really need to go into the history of Rome, the end of the papacy, or the end of paganism, pagan Rome, and then to the last 4 presidents of the United States. So that's what we're going to look at next week. And I'm going to try to get really prepared for that, believe it or not, because I know I'm not really prepared for it right now. I couldn't. To me, prepared is I can write notes without having to refer to anything. That's what I call prepared. Even though I have an understanding of it, it's too sketchy for me to just present it. So that's not really being prepared in my view. So I'm going to go over this again and try to understand that. But you can see the problem. We know that something has to happen that's going to be a catalyst to change things. And we could say maybe the pandemic has already been the catalyst to some degree. Obviously, these protests, the protesting by Black Lives Matter, and of course the riots with Antifa, however you say that, which to me is a fascist group, not an anti-fascist group, but and all the social justice warriors. And it seems to me that the world is just crazy right now, as far as I can see. There isn't any reason going on. The world is reacting, and what we're seeing is the results of postmodern thought that has, we're really not postmodernists. I mean, if you think about it, a postmodernist couldn't really drive a car anywhere with any confidence that car is going to take him from point A to point B, because we're really modernists, because only as a modernist can we use logic and reason to build things and to construct things. But postmodern thought is this idea, this deconstructionism of reality that we have, and yet the world seems willing to do it. They seem willing to defund the police departments, which would be extremely radical. What we're seeing here is the same as any revolution that has ever occurred. It seems on that level. And so I'm not really sure what's going to happen in that context. Even if July 18th doesn't happen exactly when or how we think, I would still say that this world has changed in such a way that it can never go back to what it was. There's never going to be even a normal. It's constantly going to be in a state of chaos. And that to me seems really clear. And that's why I think July 18th can happen, or will happen, is that even many Americans would love to see the end of America in some ways. Obviously, once people's personal lives are threatened, they maybe have different feelings about it. So, nuclear attack on the United States, I'm not even sure how that would affect things. I'm not sure how things would pan out in that. One is the lack of trust in media. And if we see other cities being hit, maybe New York or San Francisco, those places are suggested. What are Americans going to be doing? Are they still going to be fighting against each other? Are they going to work together? In some ways I could see scenarios where they're going to fight it against each other. Other ways I could see that maybe they could work together. So I'm not really sure. And that's the thing that's just, I shouldn't say exciting, but the time that we're living in is interesting times. And to see things happening the way that they're happening is sure interesting. And so it's, that's why we need to understand these passages in Daniel chapter 11. So I think I'm going to end there. Unless people have some comments, we have a bit of time for comments. I want to finish at in about minutes.
It seems to me that we have leaders across our nation and the states and in DC that vary, some of them wildly, in their ideas and desires and plans for our country, for the people that they govern. And I think there's going to come a point, and this possibly July 18 could bring us to a point where the people are like, we need somebody to follow here. We're the social networking group, as you pointed out. They love to follow somebody or something. Some of them want to lead, some of them do like to follow. And I think it could very easily bring us to a point where they call upon something like the United Nations or somebody like that to provide direction and control, and throw out the president and let's join the United Nations.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things that could happen. I just don't, and that's what we want to, I think Daniel 11 can give us at least a picture of what can happen as we go through this crisis. So, any other thoughts on what we've studied so far? Anybody?
Thank you. I appreciate the time to be able to sit down and read and talk about this.
Well, thank you. And it's we've had a lot of time to study over the last while. Some of that time has sort of disappeared a little bit. I work a few more hours. I have less time to study. Like today, I start work at 2:00. That's why I have to end at 1, because I have to have lunch and go to work. But I appreciate all the time that people have put into studying here. There's definitely some issues as we start to get closer that I think we will see how this has been very valuable, the time that we spent together studying so far. Well, if there's no other comments, I can close with prayer, and then we can say our goodbyes. That's unless somebody has a comment they want recorded. Okay, so let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the time that we had here today. And we know that there's much we do not understand about what's coming upon the earth, but you've given us an insight to interpret these events as they unfold. And we know, Lord, that the book of Daniel, especially Daniel 11, has been given for this time, that it's being opened and that we are understanding the events before they come to pass. Thank you for hearing our prayer, for being with us, for your care and protection, for your Holy Spirit that speaks to us and gives us conviction. And we ask for the power of obedience in our lives, that we can follow and serve you. And we pray for each person who participates, who watches the videos, who's searching for truth around the world. And we just ask, Lord, that you can work in their lives, and that you can lead those who are searching truth, that you can lead them to truth. And thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, thanks, everyone.